Alex Cox, mostly known as Lori Vallow creepy, overly devoted brother, and the third point in the criminally stupid triangle responsible for the deaths of at least 4 people. But with his sudden death in December 2019, he took a lot of critical information with him to the grave. So I wanted to take a deep dive into what we do know about this creep. So let's get into it. Hi folks, and welcome to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Delaney, a true crime writer and big time murder nerd. On this channel, I like to get into some of the worst cases, and I tend to cuss a lot. So if that sounds like your idea of a good time, then go ahead and subscribe. If not, that's cool, you do you. So in my last 2 videos, I took a closer look at the Doomsday Couple, Tammy Daybell and Lori Vallow. If you haven't seen those, be sure and check them out. I asked if y'all would be interested in me doing a similar deep dive into Alex Cox, and the answer was yes. So buckle up, buttercups, and don't look at the timestamp. First, let me just say that I got most of my info from the excellent reporting from the East Idaho News, as well as the extremely thorough deep dive that Gigi McKelvey did on her podcast, Pretty Lies and Alibis. I also got most of my background information from this book, Doomsday Mother by John Glatt. I'll put links to everything in the description. Let's start from the beginning. Alexander Lamar Cox was born January 18, 1968, the second child of Barry and Janice Cox. Their oldest was a daughter named Stacy Lynn, born in 1966. Then came Alex, then Adam in 1969, then Laura in August 1971. But Laura only lived for about 6 weeks, and the family never seems to mention her. Next, Lori was born in 1973, and then Summer in 1975. I've talked a little about the Cox family in my video on Lori, but just as a reminder, the Cox family was Mormon, though folks described them as maybe not very strict about it. And the LDS Church is, as a rule, pretty distrustful of the government, for reasons you can either agree or disagree with, but the Coxes took it way too far. Barry, and maybe Janice, I don't know, was one of these anti-government sovereign citizen types who for decades refused to pay taxes because he thinks the IRS is illegitimate. He also believes a bunch of wild conspiracy theories like most of these types do. So it's not surprising that a family like this would be extremely distrustful of law enforcement and willing to believe all kinds of wackadoo shit. I bring this up because I think it sheds light on, 1, why the Coxes were so quick to believe Lori when the kids went missing and then lie to the cops, and 2, why Lori and Alex bought into Chad's utter batshittery. But don't get it twisted. The Coxes weren't a bunch of tinfoil hat wearing nuts living in a cabin in the woods and bartering for toilet paper. Barry made a very good living selling life insurance. He even got awards from his employer for selling over $1 million in policies a year. And they liked to show off all that wealth. A family friend said that the Cox kids were spoiled and given whatever they wanted. But apart from spoiling them financially, it doesn't look like Barry and Janice were the greatest parents. I know, shocking. Like I mentioned in my video about Lori, Barry and Janice didn't have any boundaries with their kids and would discuss their sex lives in graphic detail with them or anyone else who happened to be around. They also seemed like their kids weren't a big priority for them. One family friend says that they would take off to Hawaii for days at a time and leave the kids under Alex's care. The friend says they'd leave a blank check with him for him to buy food for everyone, but Alex would just spend the money on himself on stuff like pizza and parties with his friends. This friend described the teenage Alex as creepy. He never had a girlfriend and was just, quote, fixated on Lori. She says when she and Lori would be swimming in their pool, Alex would just stare at them, which she said would give her the creeps. So she said she just tried to avoid him as much as possible. But then, when they were in the 7th grade, the friend says Lori confided in her that Alex had been trying to have sex with her. The friend said she never told anyone because she was scared and didn't really know what to do. Now, looking back, it's not surprising. Now, let's jump ahead to 1998, to one of the more mysterious incidents involving Alex. The Cox's oldest daughter, Stacy, was having a really hard time. In her 20s, she'd been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, which requires regular insulin shots and careful blood sugar monitoring. But for the last several years, Stacy had been spiraling. She'd stopped injecting her insulin regularly, allegedly under pressure from her mom to stay thin, and had instead taken a homeopathic medicine course and was using that instead. And her mental health had taken a turn for the worse. She'd developed an eating disorder, probably orthorexia from the sounds of it, and some pretty severe anxiety and OCD. There's a lot here, but the important part is that she was not well physically or mentally. And based on her condition and her refusal to get legitimate medical treatment for it, her then husband, Steve Cope, had divorced her and was awarded custody of their daughter, Melani, in 1995, when she was 6. In May of 1998, the Cox family, minus Stacy and Alex, had gone to Hawaii again. The day they arrived, they got a call from Alex. He said he'd gone over to check on Stacy and found her unconscious. The story goes that he called an ambulance and Stacy was taken away to the hospital, but never regained consciousness. Once she'd been transferred to hospice care, the Coxes booked a flight back from Hawaii. She died days later at only 31 years old. But this is where it gets a little sus. Alex being the one to find her so soon after their family left isn't in and of itself anything too shady. But apparently Alex had somehow gotten a hold of Stacy's bank cards and got caught using them either just before or just after her death. So there's that. As time went on, Alex's creepo tendencies started coming out even more. I'm not sure the exact time frame on this, but at some point he got licensed as a massage therapist in Texas, but then he lost his license for inappropriate sexual misconduct with a client. Then there's the call from his first wife, Debbie, to the Gilbert, Arizona police after Charles's murder. If you haven't heard it yet, I'll put a link in the description. But in the phone call, she tells police that Alex apparently had been excommunicated from the LDS twice because of promiscuity. She describes him as a, quote, sex addict, a label I am highly suspicious of. And he would often take trips to South America for, well, we don't really know for sure, but we do have evidence that he went to a sort of matchmaking event in Colombia in 2013, and that he sent large sums of money to someone there in 2015 and 2018. So draw your own conclusions. Anyway, Debbie's call was what made public the inappropriate relationship Alex and Lori seemed to have. I talked about this in my previous video, but just to recap, during that first marriage, Alex treated Lori in a really sexual way. They would basically dry hump right there in front of everyone, and Alex would even grab her breasts. The rest of the family would just laugh it off like it was just a big joke. Debbie also said that Alex followed Lori around like a puppy dog and would talk about her more like a jealous boyfriend than a big brother. She said that was really weirding her out, but the final straw was when they were living in Texas. Out of the blue, he came home and told her to pack their bags. They were moving out right now. She said they basically threw what they could into a truck and left that night. She later found out that he'd been caught having sex with a 15-year-old, and her father had found out and was out for Alex's ass. Now, this could be the same massage client that lost him his license, but there's no way to know. And it's not outside the realm of possibility that he'd done both things separately. Anyway, Debbie said she stayed in touch with Alex even after the divorce, including during the time he was in jail for tasing Lori's third husband, Joe Ryan. It was some of the things he had said about how he wanted to set Joe up to murder him and make it look like self-defense that prompted her to call the Gilbert PD. So, speaking of Joe Ryan, it's been reported by several people that Alex didn't like any of Lori's husbands and seemed like he was just itching for any excuse to kick their ass. Around 2006 to 2007, Lori was separated from Joe Ryan and going through that nasty divorce and custody battle. Alex was living in the Phoenix area at that time, emptying porta potties for a living and doing what he calls comedy at local clubs. He made friends with a woman named Mary Tracy, who has since spoken publicly about their friendship. While she says Alex just seemed to be a really sweet guy, there were things about him that, looking back, seemed a little off. For one, his comedy routine relied heavily on sexual jokes. Mary also says that Alex talked about masturbation a lot and would say to people like, "You look happy, did you just rub one out?" She says she witnessed him say that to his own mother. Multiple people have said that during that time, Alex was, quote, obsessed with the accusation that Joe had SA'd Tylee, and that he talked about it, quote, all the time, and had threatened to kill him. Mary says that he even asked her to call the cops on Joe and claim he had child PORN on his computer. When she refused, he laughed it off like it was a joke. That's how a lot of people described him, as a joker who would say really disturbing or inappropriate things and then just pass it off as a joke. That August 5th, 2007 attack on Joe Ryan really looked like it was set up by Lori. She and Joe were meeting to exchange Tylee at a special center that's just for that purpose. So how did Alex know he would be there if Lori hadn't told him? Anyway, Alex had apparently been waiting for Joe in the parking lot, and after Joe left the building, Alex approached him. Joe knew this whole scene was bad, so he called out to someone nearby to witness what was happening and stated clearly that this was Alex Cox, his ex's brother. Joe said he tried to just walk away, but that's when Alex tased him, saying, "This is for what you did to my nephew." Joe tried to run away, so Alex hit him in the shoulder and then again in his back with the taser, which knocked him to the ground and broke his wrist. Joe thought he'd been shot, so he started running away and yelling for help. Alex chased after him, threatening to kill him, but Joe yelled to a nearby witness to call 911. So that's when Alex ran off, got in his car, and sped away. Later, it was revealed that Lori had been sitting in her car with Tylee, watching it all, and Tylee had seen everything. Alex eventually pled down to second-degree aggravated assault and served 3 months in jail. While he was behind bars, Lori continued feeding him tales of how horrible Joe Ryan was, and Alex continued his obsession with killing him. He'd asked Mary and Debbie to send him Joe's picture and home address so he could send other inmates out after him. He thought of himself as a hero for doing what he did, and was upset that he'd actually gotten in trouble with the law for it. After completing his probation, he was apparently able to get his right to bear firearms reinstated. He also started using the story of him attacking Joe as a comedy bit, which is all over the internet now, if you can tolerate painful levels of cringe.
I was fortunate enough to do a little jail time last year. I'll confess to you guys. You ever had something that you knew was the right thing to do, but it turns out that later on it was a felony? This is a true story. I found out that my ex-brother-in-law was a pedophile, so I took a stun gun and I discharged it right in his nutsack. And I did. And in Texas, that's a felony. I'm thinking, maybe I'll get a handshake or a parade or something. I got probation.
But Joe Ryan suffered chest pains and failing health ever since that attack. In March or April of 2018, he died in his apartment under suspicious circumstances. His body wasn't found for 3 weeks, so he was already too decomposed to determine a cause of death, but it was ruled natural causes anyway. And of course, Lori got a big payout from his life insurance policy, as well as regular Social Security checks to support Tylee. But Joe's sister, who apparently was still on friendly terms with Lori at this point, said that when she visited Lori after Joe's death, Lori had shown her several of Joe's photo albums. She said those albums actually smelled like death. When she asked Lori about them, Lori told her that she had been allowed to go into Joe's apartment after he died, and that's when she'd taken them. But when you look at the crime scene photos taken when Joe's body was found, those photo albums are nowhere to be seen. So now we're getting to the part of the story that most of us already know. Since at the time I'm filming this, Lori's trial is still ongoing, more information might come to light. But for now, I want to focus on Alex's role in all of this. So before Joe's death, sometime around 2017 or 18, Lori had started consuming a lot of media about the supposedly imminent end times by various Mormon and Mormon-adjacent authors and podcasters. She'd become obsessed with the idea that the end times were just around the corner and started having delusions about talking with angels and spirits and all that. So it wasn't like Chad introduced her to most of these cuckoo beliefs. He just kind of built on top of the horseshit she already believed. Once Lori got into Chad's little proto-cult, she shared these audiobooks and podcasts by Chad and other like-minded wackadoos with Alex. Since he was a trucker at the time, he had a lot of time to listen to all this stuff, and it seems like he got into it just as hard as Lori did. So anyway, by now the story of Charles's murder is pretty well known. I talked about how Lori and Alex manipulated Tylee in Charles's murder in my video about Lori. It's important to remember that Tylee had started sleeping with a bat next to her bed in 2019, when Lori was just taking off for weeks at a time and not answering phone calls or texts. Tylee had apparently driven alone from their home in Texas to where her uncle Alex lived in Arizona, and stayed at Alex's house by herself during that time. That's when she started keeping the bat close at hand. It might have been just her very reasonable fear of being a 16-year-old girl living all alone, but knowing how creepy Alex was, I have other suspicions. This was also the time that neighbors witnessed Lori and Alex having a, quote, knockdown, drag-out fight right out in the street, where Lori yells at him that he's, quote, brought disgrace on the family. We still don't know what that fight was about, but it's just interesting. Anyway, I think Charles's murder was a tipping point for Alex. Because before, when he had attacked Joe Ryan, there was at least a reason. Whether you believe the allegations against him or not, Alex apparently did. And it's pretty common for people to want to commit violence against child molesters. That's why they have to be in segregation in prison. But there wasn't anything like that with Charles. Lori had falsely accused him of cheating, but that's hardly justification for murder. By this point, I think Alex was all in on just doing whatever Lori wanted him to. So on September 7th, 2019, one day before that last picture was taken with Tylee, Alex's cell phone was pinged at Chad's house. Not on the property, just at his house. Who knows what was said at that visit? The next day, he goes with Lori, Tylee, and JJ to Yellowstone, where they took those pictures. His truck is shown leaving the park at about 6:40, and cell phone records show him going to a barbecue joint where he only stays about 15 minutes. Maybe getting takeout? He then goes to Lori's house for about an hour, maybe eating the takeout for dinner. Then, a little after 9:30, he goes to a gas station. He then returns to Lori's apartment from 10:44 to 11:15. Maybe dropping off whatever he bought at the gas station? Anyway, from about 2:45 a.m. on the morning of the 9th, his cell phone is at Lori's apartment and stays there for about 2 hours. He then goes back to his apartment until about 9 a.m. The next place his cell phone is pinged is at Chad Daybell's backyard, near the barn and fire pit. He stays there about 2 hours before going to Del Taco and then back home. That's also when Chad sent Tammy that sketchy text about burning some brush and shooting a raccoon. And I just want to take a little trip down speculation lane here, but it always flew all over me the way Tylee's body was done as opposed to JJ's. It could be that after dismembering and burning Tylee, Chad realized that was way too much work to do it again with JJ. There's also the possibility that her body was destroyed because it might have contained some kind of evidence that Alex wanted gone. But again, that's just speculation. On September 22nd, the last day JJ was seen alive, Lori had texted Alex asking if he had eggs. Everyone is speculating that eggs was actually code for some drug, like maybe Xanax or Valium. Melani Gibb and her boyfriend at the time, David Warwick, later saw Alex carrying JJ on his shoulder up to bed. They said it looked really sweet. But the next morning, JJ was gone. When they asked Lori where he was, she said he'd been, quote, out of control and so she'd had Alex, quote, take him away. That conversation was probably happening right around the same time that Alex's cell phone was pinging on Chad Daybell's property on the north edge near the pond. Alex's cell phone records also implicated him in the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux, who is Lori's niece Melani's estranged husband, now her ex-husband. Only 2 days after burying JJ on Chad's property, Alex was back at Chad's house the morning of September 25th. He was only there 20 minutes, then left to take Charles's Jeep to get the windows tinted. The next day, he gets a burner phone. On the 28th, he goes to a gun club to do some target practice. On the 30th, he's at Lori's apartment when he gets a call from one of Chad's burner phones. He then goes back over to Chad's house, but leaves his regular phone at Lori's. Alex then makes the 14-hour drive from Rexburg to Gilbert, where Brandon has just moved with his 4 kids. As far as Brandon knows, Melani is the only person who knows his new address. But that's not the case. On October 1st, Alex uses his burner phone to search for directions to Brandon's address. He also has several calls back and forth with Chad. That night, Brandon's new neighbors report seeing the Jeep driving by his house. On October 2nd, Alex again searches for directions to Brandon's house from the temple where he was at. He parks on the street and waits for Brandon. After he shoots at him, Alex takes off and calls Chad twice. That same day, October 2nd, Lori and Chad are shown on surveillance footage at the storage facility dropping off the back seat and spare tire from that Jeep. There are also some texts as well as a 20-minute phone call to Lori from Alex's regular phone that he left with her, remember? The next day, he returns to Rexburg, and he and Lori are shown at the storage place picking up the seat and tire. Over the next several days, there are more calls between Alex and Chad on various burner phones. On October 9th, Alex buys a new burner phone. He spends some time at a gun range, then drives to a spot very near the Daybell house, where he waits for Tammy to get home. That's when he shot at her. She had thought it was just a paintball gun, and she started yelling at him and even kind of went after him. And when she yelled for Chad, her husband, Chad ran away behind the house like the cowardly little rat turd that he is. Late that night, Alex calls Zulema, and they talk for 40 minutes, the longest phone conversation they've ever had. 10 days later, Tammy would die suddenly in her bedroom of asphyxia. That's a mechanical or anatomical blockage of the airways, like suffocation, strangulation, drowning, stuff like that. Not poison. So there goes that theory. Anyway, over the next few days, Alex helps Melani move into the townhouse in Rexburg and helps Lori dump Tylee and JJ's stuff at the storage unit. He also goes to Ian Pulowski's house to pick up that Nissan Rogue. On November 1st, he drove Melani to some friends' house in Arizona, where she stood in the driveway and claimed the Holy Spirit told her that her kids were there. They creep around the house for a little while, then return to Rexburg. 2 weeks later, he drives her back to Arizona to Brandon's parents' house. And that's where we get that body cam footage of Melani being arrested while Alex is sitting in the car several doors down. He also bailed her out that night. On November 24th, 2019, Chad emails Alex that weird patriarchal blessing that we now have the recording of. Ever since I first heard about it, it had me squinting. Chad builds him up, telling him that he's a descendant of Joseph, that he's earned the right to be in this Church of the Firstborn, which is apparently what they were calling their little proto-cult. Blah, blah, blah. But the thing he keeps coming back to is calling Alex a warrior and telling him that his mission has always been to be a protector, specifically of the powerful goddess that was his sister in numerous past lives. 2 things that really stood out to me were, 1, Chad says, "You've already assisted us in ways that could never be repaid." I wonder what that could mean. And 2, "You will know when it is time to move to the other side," which is exactly what he does only 17 days later. He also tells Alex that he'll get married, and 5 days later he does just that. He marries Zulema, even though they had not really been all that interested in each other and had only gone on a couple of dates before that. They had a cheap quickie wedding in Vegas, and the officiant there remembered it for several reasons. For one, Zulema paid for everything because by this point Alex had quit his job and was apparently just devoting himself to the cause full time. The officiant said it was super quick, literally less than 10 minutes. He said it was cold and emotionless. It was also weird that Alex took Zulema's last name. So the next day they're on their honeymoon when Alex offers to give her a massage. But first he buys a drop cloth to, quote, protect the bed from oils. Zulema would later tell police that she was in and out of consciousness after that and remembers him talking on the phone but couldn't understand what he was saying. She said that afterwards, that night, he was strangely quiet. Now, a lot of people have accused Zulema of making this up for sympathy or to throw suspicion off of herself. But I think she might be telling the truth. Zulema was deep into all this, and she knew way too much. I can see where she might have been seen as a liability. So why didn't he actually kill her that night? Maybe because she hadn't added him as the beneficiary on her life insurance policy yet. That's just my speculation. And that brings us to the final days of Alex Cox. Like I said before, this is all based on what's publicly available, so more information could come out at Lori's and Chad's trials. So, Zulema told police that a few days before his death, Alex had told her, if anything happens to me, I want you to know that there's money in a bag in the closet and it's for you. Indeed, there was a duffel bag in the closet, and inside it was a Ziploc bag with several $1,000s, although Zulema is kind of cagey about the exact amount. It was also around this time that law enforcement learned that Alex did not, in fact, have the right to own firearms. But they didn't arrest him. Instead, they just put him and Zulema under surveillance. Zulema says that Alex first started complaining of chest pains and shortness of breath on December 6th. The next day, he drove to Mexico to pick up some prescriptions. On December 10th, he texted Chad and asked for a blessing, saying he'd had, quote, a bad attack and couldn't breathe. Because when you're having chest pains and shortness of breath, you don't go to the doctor. You call your cult leader. Anyway, the very next day, December 11th, Tammy's body was exhumed. Chad and Lori allegedly called Alex and told him this. Chad later texts Alex asking how he's doing. Alex responds that he was out of breath and had a resting pulse rate of 100. He also texts he thinks the poison from the spear in the heart has done some residual damage. What the actual fuck? Anyway, according to Zulema's testimony, that night Alex and Zulema discussed Tammy's exhumation, and she was questioning why, and he's denying being involved. She keeps pressing him and questioning him until he tells her, I think I'm being set up as a fall guy. So she kept pressing, and he would never give her a square answer until he finally looked up at her and said, either I'm a man of God or I'm not. Yeah, how about not? And that brings us to December 12th, 2019. Alex was supposed to drive halfway to Arizona to pick up some things for Melani, but he cancels because he says he isn't feeling good. Chad and Alex text and call each other a few times, and Chad apparently gives him a priesthood blessing. What I wouldn't give to know what was said at that blessing. Shortly after that, Lori calls Zulema at work and tells her she needs to check on Alex. I'm thinking Lori might have been on that call with Chad and they were FaceTiming or something because she tells Zulema that Alex is on the floor in the bathroom. So Zulema asks her son, Joseph, to go check on Alex. And that's where Joseph finds Alex unconscious on the floor of the upstairs bathroom, covered in his own shit. He tells his mom, who tells him to call 911, which he does. The 911 operator asks who the older male is, but Joseph only knows him as his mom's boyfriend and doesn't even know his last name. The operator tells Joseph to roll Alex over onto his back, but Joseph, understandably, doesn't want to touch the dude. Kind of a nice little piece of karma there, considering how Alex did Charles Vallow when he was on that 911 call only 6 months earlier. Anyway, Zulema arrives home while Joseph is on the phone with 911, and she takes over from there. Alex is transported to the hospital where they continue to try life-saving measures for 45 minutes before finally calling it. The medical examiner ruled that Alex Cox died of blood clots blocking the arteries in his lungs, natural causes. And I know I'm not the only person to think this, but the timing of his death just seems way too convenient. December 12th was the same day that all the various law enforcement agencies had met to coordinate their efforts on this case, and one of the main people they wanted to interview was Alex. Maybe he realized the heat was really on now that police had been questioning about JJ and somehow managed to take his own life. That line about knowing when it is time to move from the other side in that blessing from Chad, and the fact that he seemed to know he was going to die soon, kind of points in that direction. But the ME did a full toxicology report, and the only things they found in his system were caffeine and Narcan, which had been administered by the EMTs. And since the Coxes had him cremated, we'll never know for sure. If you're still here, thank you so much for sticking with me through this long, crazy shit show. What are your thoughts about Alex Cox or his suspiciously convenient death? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and give it a like and consider supporting me on Patreon. The link is in the description. Till next time, Darklings. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more. You can help me make more true crime content by supporting me on Patreon, where for as little as a cup of coffee, you can get early access to videos, bonus content, and free Murder Nerd merch. The link is in the description.